The heavy oak doors of the Westchester County Club conference room closed with finality as Marcus Thompson stepped forward to face the Homeowners Association board. Richard Sterling, 55, silver-haired HOA president, held up a photograph from security cameras. "Mr. Thompson, is this the young white woman entering your home at 11 p.m.?" The room with 40 neighbors fell silent. "We have regulations about moral standards." Marcus remained calm, his carpenter's hands steady. "That's my legal tenant." Sterling's smile turned cold. "Tenant?" "She looks 22. You're 38. We know what this really is." Whispers rippled through the crowd. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, spreading through the assembled neighbors with the efficiency that only suburban gossip could achieve. Marcus Thompson stood his ground, feeling the weight of 40 pairs of eyes upon him, each gaze carrying its own mixture of curiosity, judgment, and barely concealed prejudice. The conference room, with its mahogany panels and oil paintings of founding residents, had been designed to intimidate, to remind anyone who entered of the established order and their place within it. Marcus had never felt welcome in this space, despite owning a home in the neighborhood for 5 years, despite paying his dues on time, despite maintaining his property to standards that exceeded most of his neighbors. 3 weeks had passed since Victoria Pemberton, operating under the carefully constructed identity of Sarah Mitchell, had moved into his spare room. 3 weeks that had transformed his quiet life into a battlefield he hadn't chosen but couldn't abandon. The young woman had answered his Craigslist ad with enthusiasm and ready cash, presenting herself as a community college student in need of affordable housing near campus. Her references had checked out, her background check had been clean, and her demeanor had been respectful and professional. Marcus had needed the rental income to maintain his daughter Maya's enrollment at St. Catherine's Academy, the private school his late wife Lisa had insisted upon before cancer claimed her 3 years ago. Marcus's life before Victoria's arrival had been structured around simple routines that kept grief at bay and provided stability for Maya. He would rise at 5 each morning, spending an hour in his workshop before Maya woke, letting the familiar feel of wood grain beneath his fingers ground him in the present rather than the past. The workshop, a converted garage behind the house, housed the tools of his trade and the dreams he shaped into reality. Thompson Custom Furniture had built its reputation piece by piece, each commissioned work a testament to the craftsmanship that 3 generations of Thompson men had perfected. His grandfather had been a carpenter in Alabama, creating beauty from scrap wood during the Depression, selling pieces for pennies to feed his family. His father had brought those skills north during the Great Migration, eventually opening a small furniture repair shop in Brooklyn that served the neighborhood for 30 years. Marcus had taken that legacy and elevated it, combining traditional techniques with modern design sensibilities that attracted clients who valued artistry over mass production. $75,000 a year wasn't wealth by Westchester standards, but it had been enough until Lisa's medical bills and Maya's tuition created a financial strain that threatened to unravel everything they had built together. The house itself had been Lisa's inheritance from her grandmother, a woman who had defied her family's objections to embrace Lisa's choice of husband. The 4-bedroom colonial sat on a corner lot that developers coveted, its wraparound porch and mature oak trees, speaking to an earlier era when Westchester had been countryside rather than suburb. Lisa had loved the house's history, the way sunlight streamed through the original stained glass windows, the creak of hardwood floors that had supported 5 generations of footsteps. She had died in the master bedroom, surrounded by the life they had created together, making Marcus promise to keep the house for Maya, to maintain this connection to her mother's family, even if that family had largely abandoned them after the marriage. The decision to rent the spare room had not come easily. The space had been Lisa's home office, where she had worked as a freelance graphic designer, her creative energy filling the room with color swatches and design boards that Marcus still couldn't bring himself to remove. But practicality had won over sentiment when Maya's tuition bill arrived with a 10% increase and his biggest client had delayed payment on a major commission due to their own financial troubles. The ad had been simple and straightforward. Furnished room in quiet family home, professional or student preferred, references required, no smoking, no pets, $500 monthly plus utilities. The responses had been illuminating in their predictability. The first 3 callers had been enthusiastic until they heard his voice, the subtle deepening of tone that marked him as black to those attuned to such markers. They had suddenly remembered other options they wanted to explore first. Those who did arrive for viewings often couldn't hide their surprise at finding a black man in this neighborhood, in this house, offering this rental. Some had been bold enough to ask how long he had lived there, whether he owned or was managing for someone else, what the real owner thought about renting to strangers. One woman had actually asked if the police patrolled regularly, for safety, she had added, as if Marcus himself might be the danger she feared. Victoria had been different from the moment she knocked on the door. She hadn't flinched or hesitated when Marcus answered, hadn't scanned the street nervously or clutched her purse tighter. She had extended her hand for a firm handshake, looked him directly in the eye, and asked intelligent questions about utilities, laundry facilities, and whether she could use the kitchen occasionally for meal prep. Her story had been plausible enough. Sarah Mitchell, 23, enrolled at Westchester Community College for creative writing courses, working part-time at a local diner to make ends meet, needing a quiet place to study and write her novel. What Marcus couldn't have known was that Victoria Pemberton had spent 3 months preparing this identity with the thoroughness her mother Eleanor brought to corporate acquisitions worth billions. The real Sarah Mitchell was a friend from Yale who had agreed to let Victoria use her name and basic identity, thinking it was for a novel research project. The enrollment at community college was real. Victoria had actually registered and attended classes, finding the experience both humbling and enlightening. The diner job was real too, though she donated her wages to a homeless shelter, unable to stomach keeping money she didn't need when others were truly struggling. Victoria's motivation for this elaborate deception went deeper than simple rebellion against privilege or research for a novel, though both played a role. She had grown up in a bubble of extreme wealth that had insulated her from authentic human experience. Her childhood had been a carousel of private schools, summer homes, and charity galas where problems were discussed but never felt. Her father, Thomas Pemberton, had inherited old oil money and spent his life managing investments from a Manhattan office that looked down on people who actually worked for a living. Her mother, Eleanor, had built a pharmaceutical empire through brilliant science and ruthless business acumen, but had little time for the emotional education of her only daughter. The novel Victoria wanted to write was meant to be her bridge to authenticity, her way of contributing something real to a world that had given her everything except purpose. But every draft felt hollow, every character a cardboard cutout of real people she had never truly known. How could she write about struggle when her biggest challenge had been choosing between Harvard and Yale? How could she capture working-class dignity when everyone she knew either had trust funds or aspired to them? The decision to live anonymously among regular people had seemed like the only way to break through her creative block and perhaps find something genuine in herself. She had chosen Westchester deliberately, knowing it would place her at the intersection of different worlds. Not the desperate poverty that would have been poverty tourism, but the middle-class struggle that most Americans actually lived. She had researched Marcus Thompson before answering his ad, finding public records about his wife's death, his business registration, his daughter's school enrollment. He had seemed perfect for her purposes, respectable, established, facing real but manageable challenges. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly her academic interest would transform into personal investment. The first evening in the house had shattered her preconceptions. She had expected tension, maybe resentment at having to take in a tenant. Instead, she had found a home filled with quiet love and careful preservation. Maya's artwork covered the refrigerator, each piece dated and celebrated. Family photos lined the hallways, including ones of Lisa, kept prominent rather than hidden away in grief. The smell of dinner cooking, something with herbs Victoria couldn't identify, but that made her stomach growl with genuine hunger rather than the polite appetite of her usual world. Marcus and Maya had eaten at the kitchen table, talking about school, about a woodworking project, about normal things, with an ease that made Victoria's chest ache with unrecognized longing. Through the thin walls of the old house, Victoria had learned the rhythm of their lives. Marcus's alarm at 5, the quiet sounds of him moving through his morning routine, careful not to wake Maya. The workshop sounds that began at 5:30, rhythmic sanding or precise sawing that became almost meditative to listen to. Maya's alarm at 6:30, followed by the negotiations over breakfast choices and the gentle reminders about homework and library books. The car starting at 7:45 for the school run, returning 20 minutes later. Then the workshop sounds would resume, continuing until lunch when Marcus would come inside to eat a simple meal while reviewing orders or sketching designs. The evenings had been revelations. Marcus helped Maya with homework without doing it for her, asking guiding questions that led her to answers rather than simply providing them. They cooked dinner together, Maya standing on a step stool to reach the counter, learning measurements and following recipes with scientific precision. After dinner came reading time, Marcus's voice carrying through the walls as he brought characters to life with distinct voices and sound effects that made Maya giggle. The bedtime ritual was consistent: teeth brushing, prayers that mentioned mommy in heaven, and lights out by 8:30. Then Marcus would return to his workshop for another 2 hours, creating beauty from raw wood while the neighborhood settled into sleep. Victoria had begun documenting these observations in her journal, telling herself it was character research. But as days turned into weeks, the entries had become less analytical and more personal. She found herself listening for Marcus's footsteps, timing her own movements to catch glimpses of him working. She watched from her window as he taught Maya to ride her bike without training wheels in the backyard, his patience infinite as she fell and got up again and again. She observed him dealing with difficult clients on the phone, maintaining professionalism even when they questioned his prices or expertise in ways that carried racial undertones. The neighborhood's reaction to Victoria's presence had begun within days of her arrival. Mrs. Henderson from 2 houses down had been the first to notice, her daily power walks conveniently rerouted to pass the Thompson house multiple times. Victoria had been returning from her shift at the diner one evening when Mrs. Henderson had intercepted her on the sidewalk. "You must be the new tenant," Mrs. Henderson had said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "How brave of you, living with a single man. People might get the wrong idea." Victoria had played innocent. "What wrong idea?" "Mr. Thompson has been completely professional." "Oh, I'm sure he has," Mrs. Henderson had replied, her tone suggesting the opposite. "It's just that people talk, you know. A young, pretty white girl like you, living with, well, you understand." Victoria had understood perfectly. The racism was barely veiled, wrapped in concern for propriety but rooted in the deep discomfort of seeing a black man in a position of power over a white woman, even the limited power of being a landlord. She had wanted to confront Mrs. Henderson directly, but that would have blown her cover and potentially made things worse for Marcus. Instead, she had smiled sweetly and said she felt perfectly safe. "Thank you for your concern." But Mrs. Henderson had only been the beginning. The whispers had spread through the neighborhood with viral efficiency. Victoria could feel eyes on her whenever she came or went from the house. Neighbors who had previously ignored Marcus now watched him constantly, looking for evidence of impropriety that existed only in their prejudiced imaginations. The mailman had started making comments about all the activity at the house, though Victoria only left for work and returned, hardly excessive coming and going. The teenage boys next door had begun making crude jokes loud enough to be heard over the fence, their parents doing nothing to stop them. Marcus had handled it all with a dignity that both impressed and frustrated Victoria. He never acknowledged the stares, never responded to the whispers, never gave them the reaction they were trying to provoke. He continued his routine, continued his work, continued being a devoted father to Maya. But Victoria could see the toll it was taking in the tightness around his eyes, the way he held Maya's hand a little tighter in public, the way he had installed new security cameras around the property. The anonymous notes had started in the second week. Simple messages at first. "We're watching. Think about your daughter. This isn't appropriate." Each one carefully printed to avoid handwriting identification. Each one placed in the mailbox at night to avoid being seen. Marcus had kept them all in a folder, his instinct for documentation kicking in. Victoria had seen him photographing each one, creating a digital trail of harassment that might be needed later. The escalation had been gradual but relentless. Garbage cans overturned the night before collection, forcing Marcus to clean up the mess before work. His truck tires deflated when he had important deliveries scheduled, costing him time and money to fix. A long scratch down the driver's side that appeared overnight, too deliberate to be accidental but impossible to prove as vandalism. Someone had called his clients, spreading rumors about his lifestyle that cost him 2 commissions from people who suddenly decided to go in a different direction. The worst had been the impact on Maya. The 8-year-old had gone from a confident, outgoing child to someone who looked over her shoulder constantly. Her friends had stopped coming over for playdates, their parents making transparent excuses about busy schedules. At school, children repeated what they heard at home, asking Maya if her daddy had a girlfriend, if the white lady was her new mommy, if they were going to have to move away. Maya had stopped eating lunch at school, sitting alone with her sandwich untouched. afraid that anything she did might make things worse. Victoria had watched this destruction of a child's innocence with growing rage and guilt. She had brought this scrutiny to their door, even if the prejudice had always been there waiting for an excuse to manifest. She found herself wanting to protect Maya, to shield her from the cruelty of people who should know better. During one particularly bad evening, when Maya had come home crying because her best friend had said she couldn't play with her anymore, Victoria had found herself at Maya's bedroom door. "Can I come in?" she had asked softly. Maya had nodded, her face streaked with tears. Victoria had sat on the bed, careful to maintain appropriate distance, and asked what was wrong. The story had poured out in typical 8-year-old fashion, jumping between events and emotions, but the core was clear. Maya was being punished for something she didn't understand, something that had to do with her father's skin color and Victoria's presence. "It's not fair," Maya had said finally, exhausted from crying. "You're right," Victoria had agreed. "It's not fair at all. But you know what? Your daddy is one of the bravest men I've ever met. He stands up for what's right even when it's hard. And you're brave too, just like him." "I don't feel brave," Maya had whispered. "Being brave doesn't mean you don't feel scared or sad," Victoria had explained. "It means you keep going even when you do feel those things, and you get up every day and go to school and try your best. That's brave." Maya had looked at her with eyes that were too knowing for 8 years old. "Are you going to leave because of all the mean people?" Victoria had been caught off guard by the directness of the question and the fear behind it. "I'm not going anywhere," she had promised, meaning it in that moment despite knowing her deception couldn't last forever. The conversation had been interrupted by Marcus appearing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Victoria had excused herself quickly, aware that she had crossed a line from tenant to something more involved. But later that evening, Marcus had knocked on her door. "Thank you," he had said simply, "for talking to Maya. She seems better." "I hope I didn't overstep," Victoria had replied. "You didn't. She needs people who care about her. Her mother would have known what to say. I'm just doing my best." "Your best is pretty amazing," Victoria had said, then immediately regretted the familiarity of it. Marcus had studied her for a moment, something shifting in his expression. "Can I ask you something? Why did you really choose this room? You're clearly educated beyond community college. Your hands have never done manual labor. You pay in cash but never seem worried about money. So why are you here?" Victoria had felt the moment of truth approaching but couldn't bring herself to confess yet. "I'm trying to find something real," she had said, which was true if incomplete, my life before. It wasn't authentic. I needed to understand how real people live, how they struggle and survive and find meaning. I'm writing about it, but more than that, I'm trying to learn from it. Marcus had accepted this partial truth with a nod. "Real isn't always pretty," he had warned, "as you're seeing. But it's honest," Victoria had countered. "And there's beauty in that honesty, in the dignity of people like you who face injustice and don't let it break them." They had stood in her doorway for another moment, an understanding passing between them that went beyond landlord and tenant, beyond black and white, beyond their different worlds. It was the recognition of two people seeing each other clearly, even if one of them was still hiding behind a false name. Richard Sterling's campaign against Marcus had been orchestrated with the precision of someone experienced in forcing out unwanted neighbors. As HOA president for 6 years, Sterling had refined his techniques for maintaining what he called community standards, but what amounted to systematic discrimination against anyone who didn't fit his vision of suburban perfection. His development company, Sterling Properties LLC, had benefited from every forced sale, acquiring properties at distressed prices and flipping them for massive profits. Sterling's own financial desperation added urgency to his campaign against Marcus. The Thompson house sat on a corner lot that was crucial to Sterling's proposed townhouse development, a project that could save him from bankruptcy if he could acquire the land in the next 6 months. He had approached Marcus 2 years ago with an offer to buy, but Marcus had refused, citing his promise to Lisa to keep the house for Maya. Sterling had been patient then, but patience was a luxury he could no longer afford with creditors closing in and his business empire crumbling. The HOA meeting had been scheduled with the minimum legally required notice, 72 hours posted on the community bulletin board that few people checked regularly. Sterling had personally called his allies to ensure attendance while hoping those sympathetic to Marcus might miss the announcement. He had prepared a presentation that painted Victoria's presence as a threat to property values, community safety, and the moral fabric of the neighborhood. never explicitly mentioning race, but letting the implications hang heavy in the air. Standing before the assembled neighbors now, Marcus felt the weight of history on his shoulders. His grandmother had faced down police dogs in Birmingham, marching for the right to exist as a full human being. His father had integrated a previously all-white engineering firm, enduring decades of isolation and overlooked promotions with quiet determination. His mother had taught in inner-city schools for 30 years, believing that education was the path to liberation, even when the system seemed designed to fail her students. They had all fought battles so that Marcus could live in a house like this, in a neighborhood like this, with opportunities they could only dream of. But here he was, fighting the same battle in a different form, racism dressed in suburban respectability rather than white hoods, but just as destructive. "Mr. Thompson," Sterling continued, his voice carrying the false concern of a practiced manipulator, "we're not questioning your rights as a homeowner. We're simply concerned about the message being sent to our children when a single man of your situation brings a young woman into his home. Surely you can understand how it looks." "What I understand," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the fire in his chest, "is that you've made assumptions based on nothing but prejudice. Miss Mitchell is a tenant with a legal lease. I've provided all documentation to prove this. Your implications are not only false, but defamatory." "No one is implying anything inappropriate," Sterling said smoothly, though his entire presentation had done exactly that. "We're simply noting that the optics are concerning. A 38-year-old man, a 22-year-old woman, sharing a home. If the races were reversed, we wouldn't be having this meeting," Marcus interrupted. "And we all know it." The room erupted in protests and denials. How dare he play the race card? This had nothing to do with race. They would be equally concerned about any inappropriate situation. The lies came easily to lips that had never been forced to examine their own biases, to people who believed that because they didn't use racial slurs, they couldn't be racist. Victoria watched from the coffee shop across the street, her phone recording through the window, her heart breaking with each word spoken against Marcus. She had called her mother's lawyer an hour ago, asking for advice without revealing the full situation. The lawyer had been clear. The HOA's actions were illegal, discriminatory, and actionable. But proving discrimination was always harder than committing it, requiring evidence of pattern and practice that went beyond a single incident. She had that evidence. Over the past 3 weeks, she had documented everything: the anonymous notes, the vandalism, the whispered comments, the social isolation imposed on both Marcus and Maya. She had recordings of neighbors saying things they would never repeat in court, but that revealed their true motivations. She had photographs of Sterling himself on Marcus's property at night, placing the for sale sign that had mysteriously appeared. She had financial documents showing Sterling's desperate need for Marcus's property, obtained through connections she could never explain as Sarah Mitchell, but that Victoria Pemberton could access with a single phone call. The meeting continued with neighbor after neighbor standing to voice their concerns. Mrs. Patterson worried about the example being set for children, though her own son had been arrested twice for drunk driving. Mr. Davis cited property values, though the only thing driving them down was the hostility toward one of the few black families in the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen expressed concern about those people moving in, carefully not specifying who those people were but making her meaning clear through tone and context. Through it all, Marcus stood straight and dignified, a lighthouse in a storm of prejudice. He thought of Maya at home with Mrs. Walker, the elderly black woman who had become their lifeline in this hostile environment. Dorothy Walker had lived in Westchester for over 60 years, had watched the neighborhood transform from farmland to suburbs, had seen waves of discrimination target different groups, but always with the same underlying hatred. She had warned Marcus when he first moved in that the acceptance he felt was conditional, that it would evaporate the moment he stepped outside the boundaries they had set for him. "You can live here," she had said, "as long as you're grateful and quiet. The moment you act like you actually belong, like this is really your home, they'll show you who they really are." She had been right, of course. As long as Marcus had been the grieving widower, keeping to himself, maintaining his property, and being a good but invisible neighbor, he had been tolerated. But Victoria's presence had disrupted the narrative they had constructed for him. A young white woman choosing to live in his house suggested that he had power, agency, and desirability that challenged their fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy. The vote was called after an hour of discussion that had never been a discussion at all, but rather a ritual of justification for a decision that had been made before anyone entered the room. Sterling called for a show of hands in favor of issuing a formal demand that Marcus evict his tenant or face escalating fines that would eventually force the sale of his home. One by one, hands rose. Mrs. Henderson's went up first, quickly followed by the Brennans, the Davises, the Pattersons. Some hands rose reluctantly, people who knew this was wrong but feared becoming targets themselves if they dissented. Others rose eagerly, finally given permission to express prejudices they usually had to hide. Marcus counted 23 hands in favor, more than enough to carry the motion. But before Sterling could declare the vote concluded, the conference room door opened. Dorothy Walker entered slowly but deliberately, her cane tapping against the floor in a rhythm that demanded attention. At 91 years old, she moved with the authority of someone who had earned every one of her years through struggle and survival. Behind her came Diana Martinez, the Child Protective Services worker who had investigated the false reports against Marcus. Behind Diana came James Williams, Marcus's friend from the Veterans Support Group, who also happened to be a civil rights attorney. And behind James came a young woman with a press badge, her camera already recording. "This is a closed meeting," Sterling said, his composure cracking slightly. "Nothing about discrimination is closed," Dorothy replied, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had marched with King. "I've been watching you, Richard Sterling, the same way I watched you force out the Johnson family 2 years ago, the Patels before that, the Washingtons before that. Always the same pattern: harassment, false reports, HOA violations that don't exist until families are so broken they sell to you for pennies on the dollar." She placed a thick folder on the conference table. 3 families in 2 years, all minorities, all forced out through campaigns exactly like this one, all sold to Sterling Properties, LLC. All now worth 3 times what you paid. That's not coincidence, Mr. Sterling. That's conspiracy. The room had gone silent except for the sound of the reporter's camera clicking. Sterling's face had drained of color as he realized the scope of what Dorothy had compiled. His lawyer was whispering urgently in his ear, undoubtedly advising him to end this meeting immediately. Diana Martinez stepped forward. "I'm here in my personal capacity, but I can confirm that there have been 6 false reports filed against Mr. Thompson with CPS. 6. All from the same phone number, which traces back to a burner phone purchased with a credit card belonging to Sterling Properties, LLC. Filing false reports with CPS is a felony, Mr. Sterling. Each count carries up to 5 years in prison." James Williams added his voice to the chorus of accusation. "I've been documenting the harassment against my client for 3 weeks. We have video evidence of vandalism, recordings of discriminatory statements, and a clear pattern of conspiracy to violate the Fair Housing Act. If this vote proceeds, every single person who raises their hand becomes a co-defendant in a federal civil rights lawsuit." The hands that had been so eager to rise moments before now stayed firmly at sides. Board members looked at each other nervously, realizing they had walked into a legal minefield. The unified front Sterling had constructed was crumbling in real time. But Sterling, desperate and cornered, made one last attempt to salvage his plan. "These are all very serious allegations," he said, trying to project authority he no longer possessed. "But they don't change the facts of the current situation. Mr. Thompson has brought a young woman into his home." "I've brought a tenant into my home," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying a power that made everyone turn to look at him. "A legal tenant with a valid lease who has done nothing wrong except exist while white in proximity to a black man. Your problem isn't with her behavior or mine. Your problem is that you cannot conceive of a relationship between a black man and a white woman that isn't either predatory or transactional. That says everything about you and nothing about us." Victoria chose that moment to enter the room. She had been watching from outside, waiting for the right moment to reveal herself without revealing everything. She walked in wearing the same thrift store clothes she always wore as Sarah Mitchell, but carrying herself with an authority that came from years of watching her mother command boardrooms. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she said, though the lie felt heavy on her tongue. "I'm the tenant you're all so concerned about. I'm here to tell you that Mr. Thompson has been nothing but professional and appropriate. I have never felt unsafe or uncomfortable. The only harassment I've experienced has been from this community, from people who see something sinister in the simple act of renting a room." She pulled out her phone and connected it to the conference room's presentation system, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "I've documented everything. Every piece of harassment directed at Mr. Thompson and his daughter. Every racist comment made when you thought no one was recording. Every act of vandalism. Every threatening note. Every false report. Would you like me to play some highlights for the room? The protests were immediate and panicked, but Victoria pressed play. The room filled with the voices of neighbors, their casual racism preserved in digital clarity. I just don't feel safe with him here, you know how they are. Property values always drop when they move in. It's just statistics. That poor little girl, growing up without a proper mother figure, and now with that woman there. Maybe if enough of us complain, he'll get the message and leave. Each comment was a nail in the coffin of Sterling's campaign. The neighbors who had spoken these words tried to leave, but the room was too crowded, the door blocked by Dorothy and her allies. They were forced to stand there, exposed, their private prejudices made public. Sterling's lawyer finally succeeded in pulling him away from the podium. "We need to end this meeting now," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "My client will be making no further statements." But the damage was done. The reporter was already typing on her phone, undoubtedly filing a story that would be online within the hour. The board members who had been ready to vote with Sterling were now distancing themselves, claiming they had been misled, that they had no idea about the pattern of discrimination, that they would never have participated if they had known. "This meeting is adjourned," Sterling said, though his voice carried no authority anymore. As people began to file out, many approached Marcus with sudden friendliness, trying to claim they had never believed the rumors, that they had always known he was a good man, that they were shocked by Sterling's behavior. Marcus accepted their false apologies with silent dignity, neither forgiving nor condemning, simply allowing them to expose their own cowardice. Dorothy Walker approached him as the room emptied. "You did good, son," she said quietly. "Stood tall just like your ancestors would have wanted." "I had help," Marcus replied, looking at the elderly woman with deep gratitude. "We all need help sometimes," Dorothy said. "That's how we survive. That's how we win." Victoria stood nearby, wanting to approach but unsure of her welcome. The adrenaline of confrontation was fading, leaving her with the weight of her deception and the growing realization that her feelings for Marcus had become far more than research or sympathy. She had fallen in love with his strength, his dignity, his devotion to Maya, the way he created beauty in his workshop while ugliness surrounded him. Marcus finally approached her as the room cleared. "Thank you," he said simply, "for standing up for us." "I should be thanking you," Victoria replied, "for showing me what real courage looks like." They stood there for a moment, the connection between them palpable but impossible to act upon. Not here, not now, not while she was still his tenant and still lying about who she really was. The next morning brought swift consequences for Sterling. The FBI arrived at his home at dawn, executing a search warrant based on the financial crimes Dorothy's investigation had uncovered. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as agents carried boxes of evidence from the house Sterling had leveraged to the hilt in his desperate attempts to stay afloat. The charges were extensive and damning: wire fraud, tax evasion, embezzlement of HOA funds, conspiracy to violate the Fair Housing Act, and 6 counts of filing false reports with Child Protective Services. The local news coverage was extensive and unflattering. Reporters stood outside Marcus's house, though he declined all interviews, wanting to protect Maya from further exposure. The story went regional, then national, as journalists connected Sterling's pattern to broader issues of housing discrimination in affluent suburbs. The carefully maintained image of Westchester as a progressive, welcoming community was shattered, replaced by uncomfortable questions about how many Sterling-like campaigns happened without exposure. The HOA board moved quickly to distance themselves from Sterling, electing Dorothy Walker as interim president despite her never having served on the board before. Her first act was to void all the discriminatory policies Sterling had implemented under the guise of community standards. The anonymous complaint system was abolished. The vague morality clauses were removed. Financial transparency measures were implemented to prevent future embezzlement. For Marcus, the victory felt hollow. Sterling was gone, but the damage to Maya remained. She still flinched when neighbors looked at them too long. She still asked if they were going to have to move. She still had nightmares about police taking her father away. The psychological wounds inflicted on an 8-year-old child would take far longer to heal than the time it took to arrest Sterling. Victoria struggled with her own guilt and the growing weight of her deception. She had documented everything for her novel, but the pages felt like betrayal now. How could she write about Marcus's dignity when she had been lying to him from the beginning? How could she capture Maya's innocence when she had contributed to its loss? How could she express the love she felt when it was built on a foundation of dishonesty? 3 days after the meeting, she knocked on Marcus's workshop door. He was sanding a table, the rhythmic motion meditative and calming. He looked up when she entered, setting down his sandpaper. "I need to tell you something," Victoria said, her heart pounding. Marcus waited, patient as always. "My name isn't Sarah Mitchell. It's Victoria Pemberton. My mother is Eleanor Pemberton, CEO of Pemberton Pharmaceuticals." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Marcus absorbed this information, pieces clicking into place. The manicured hands that had never known labor. The perfect teeth that spoke of childhood orthodontia. The confidence that came from never doubting your place in the world. The cash payments that never seemed to strain her budget. "You lied to me," he said finally, his voice neutral but hurt evident in his eyes. "Yes," Victoria admitted. "I wanted to write a novel about real America, and I thought I needed to live it to understand it. I didn't expect to care. I didn't expect to fall in love with you and Maya." The word love hung between them, honest but complicated by everything surrounding it. "So we were research?" Marcus asked, the hurt now clear in his voice. "At first, maybe, for about a day. Then you became real to me, more real than anyone in my actual life has ever been. What I feel for you, for Maya, it's the truest thing I've ever experienced." Marcus stood, pacing to the window that overlooked the backyard where Maya's swing set stood. "I can't be with someone who lies to me, and I can't be with you while you're my tenant. It would validate everything Sterling said about us." "I know," Victoria said, tears threatening but held back. "That's why I'm moving out. Today. But I don't want to lose you and Maya. Can we start over? Do things right this time? No lies, no pretense, just truth?" Marcus turned to face her, seeing the genuine pain and hope in her eyes. "If we do this, we do it right. We date properly. We consider Maya in every decision. We prove to everyone, including ourselves, that what we have is real and worth fighting for." "Yes," Victoria agreed immediately. "Whatever it takes." The transition was careful and deliberate. Victoria moved into a small apartment 10 minutes away, far enough to maintain propriety but close enough to remain present in their lives. She kept the apartment simple, not wanting to flaunt the wealth that she could now access as herself rather than as Sarah Mitchell. The first official date was a week later, dinner at a quiet restaurant where they could talk without the weight of surveillance. "Tell me who you really are," Marcus had said over appetizers. Victoria had told him everything. About growing up in a Manhattan penthouse with views of Central Park but no real friends. About boarding schools where she learned 5 languages but never learned how to connect with people. About her father who measured success in stock portfolios and her mother who built an empire but didn't know her daughter's favorite color. About the novel she wanted to write that would bridge the gap between her world and the real world, though she now understood how naive that ambition had been. Marcus had listened without judgment, asking occasional questions but mostly letting her unveil herself layer by layer. When she finished, exhausted from the emotional weight of honest confession, he had reached across the table to take her hand. "I see you," he had said simply, "the real you, and I'm still here." The tears had come then, relief and gratitude and love overwhelming her defenses. They had sat there holding hands while she cried, the restaurant fading away until it was just the two of them, honest and exposed and choosing each other despite everything. Eleanor Pemberton had not taken the news well initially. Her daughter, her Yale-educated, multilingual heir to billions daughter, was dating a carpenter, a widowed carpenter with a child, living in the suburbs instead of Manhattan. The initial phone conversation had been tense, with Eleanor deploying every argument from practicality to social pressure to dynasty building. But Victoria had stood firm, and eventually, Eleanor had agreed to meet Marcus. The meeting had been arranged at Marcus's house, Victoria insisting that her mother see him in his element, rather than some neutral restaurant where Eleanor could control the environment. Eleanor had arrived in a town car that looked absurdly out of place on the suburban street, her designer suit and perfect posture making her seem like visiting royalty. But then Maya had answered the door, polite and sweet, offering to take Eleanor's coat and asking if she would like some lemonade that she and Daddy had made fresh that morning. Something in Eleanor's expression had softened at the child's genuine warmth. Throughout the afternoon, she had watched Marcus with his daughter, seen the gentle way he guided without controlling, the patience with which he answered endless questions, the love that infused every interaction. She had also toured his workshop, initially skeptical but gradually impressed by the artistry of his pieces. This wasn't just furniture. It was functional art, each piece revealing a deep understanding of form and function, beauty and utility. When Marcus had explained the history of a particular joint technique passed down from his grandfather, Eleanor had recognized the same passion for craft that had driven her to build a pharmaceutical empire from a single revolutionary drug patent. "He's not what I expected," Eleanor had admitted to Victoria privately before leaving. "He's everything I never knew I needed," Victoria had replied. "I can see that," Eleanor had said, and Victoria had heard acceptance, if not enthusiasm, in her mother's voice. The relationship progressed slowly and carefully, both Marcus and Victoria aware that they were under scrutiny from multiple directions. The neighborhood watched to see if their worst assumptions would be confirmed. The media, having picked up the story of Sterling's downfall, occasionally sent reporters to check on the interracial romance that exposed suburban racism. Maya watched to see if this new person in their lives would stay or disappear like so many others had. Maya had been the one to really test Victoria, with the honest brutality that only children can deploy. "Are you going to be my new mom?" she had asked one afternoon while Victoria helped her with homework. "I don't know," Victoria had answered honestly. "Would you want me to be?" Maya had considered this seriously. "My first mom died. If you become my new mom, will you die too?" The question had broken Victoria's heart. "Everyone dies eventually," she had said carefully. "But I'm young and healthy, and I plan to be around for a very long time." "Promise?" Maya had asked, her 8-year-old eyes holding too much knowledge of loss. "I promise to try my very best to stay safe and healthy, and here for you," Victoria had said, knowing better than to make promises about things beyond her control. Maya had accepted this with a nod, then returned to her math homework as if they hadn't just discussed mortality and commitment. The community's transformation was gradual and incomplete. Some neighbors genuinely examined their prejudices and worked to change. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had initially been silent during Sterling's campaign, became a vocal advocate for diversity and inclusion, organizing community dialogues and bringing in speakers to address implicit bias. The Johnsons, a young couple who had moved in recently, made a point of inviting Marcus and Maya to their gatherings, their children playing together without the weight of racial awareness. But others simply retreated into polite distance, their prejudices intact but hidden. The Hendersons still watched Marcus's house with suspicious eyes but no longer voiced their concerns publicly. The Brennans still believed property values were threatened by diversity but kept those opinions to their dinner table. The veneer of suburban civility was restored, but the rot beneath remained for many. Marcus's business, however, thrived in the aftermath of the scandal. The story of his dignified stand against discrimination had resonated with people who valued both his craftsmanship and his character. Orders came from across the country, some from people who had experienced similar discrimination and wanted to support someone who had fought back. He hired 2 employees, both young men from minority backgrounds who needed not just jobs but mentorship and belief in their potential. Eleanor Pemberton had offered him a contract to furnish all of Pemberton Pharmaceuticals' offices, a deal worth over $500,000. Marcus had negotiated hard, not accepting charity but demanding fair terms and realistic timelines. He had won Eleanor's respect in that negotiation, showing the same business acumen in his field that she showed in hers. "You could expand," Eleanor had suggested. "With the right investment, Thompson Custom Furniture could become a major brand." "I don't want an empire," Marcus had replied. "I want to make beautiful things with my hands and teach others to do the same. I want to be home for dinner with my daughter. I want a life, not just a business." Eleanor had nodded, understanding in a way that surprised her. She had chosen empire and had paid the price in missed moments with Victoria, in a daughter who had to create an elaborate deception just to understand how normal people lived. 6 months after the HOA meeting, Marcus proposed to Victoria. He did it in his workshop, surrounded by the tools of his trade and pieces in various stages of completion. The ring was one he had made himself, combining white gold and dark wood in a design that represented their 2 worlds joining. Maya had been his co-conspirator, barely able to contain her excitement as Victoria arrived for what she thought was just dinner. "Victoria Pemberton," Marcus had said, dropping to one knee while Maya bounced beside him. "You entered my life under false pretenses, turned it upside down, and made me fight battles I didn't choose. You also showed me that love doesn't care about race or class or the prejudices of small minds. You stood by us when you could have walked away. You chose truth when lies were easier. Will you marry me? Victoria had said yes through tears, dropping to her knees to kiss him while Maya cheered and danced around them. The ring had fit perfectly, the wood warm against her skin, the gold catching the light from the workshop windows. The engagement had made news, a follow-up to the story that had captivated audiences months before. Love Wins, interracial couple who exposed suburban racism to Wednesday. Marcus and Victoria had declined most interview requests, but they had agreed to one joint appearance on a morning show, using the platform to talk about housing discrimination and the importance of standing up to prejudice even when it was costly. The wedding was held a year later in the backyard of the house that had been a battlefield. Dorothy Walker officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. Maya was the flower girl, taking her job seriously as she scattered rose petals with scientific precision. James Williams was Marcus's best man, while Victoria's friend from Yale, who had lent her the Sarah Mitchell identity, served as maid of honor, still amazed by how far her friend's research project had gone. The guest list had been deliberately diverse, bringing together Victoria's world of privilege and Marcus's world of craft and struggle. Eleanor had initially been uncomfortable but had gradually relaxed, especially after Dorothy Walker had cornered her for a long conversation about resilience and legacy. By the reception, Eleanor was dancing with Marcus's employees, her designer shoes kicked off, laughing in a way Victoria hadn't seen since childhood. Richard Sterling, serving 18 years in federal prison, had sent a letter that arrived the day before the wedding. Marcus had debated whether to open it, finally deciding to read it with Victoria. The letter had been an apology, seemingly genuine, acknowledging the racism Sterling had denied for so long and the harm he had caused. He had ended with a request for forgiveness, not expecting it but needing to ask. Marcus had held the letter for a long moment, then walked to his workshop. He had returned with a simple wooden box, one of his earliest pieces, imperfect but honest. "I made this when I was learning," he had told Victoria. "It's flawed, but it's still functional, still has value. People are like that too. Flawed but capable of function, of value even after they've done wrong." He had placed Sterling's letter in the box. "I forgive him, not for his sake, but for mine, for ours, for Maya. Carrying hatred is like holding a hot coal. It only burns the one holding it." They had made love that night with a tenderness that came from knowing how much they had overcome to be together, how many forces had tried to keep them apart, how their love was both personal and political, private and public, a choice and a statement. The wedding day had dawned clear and bright, one of those perfect spring days that made even suburban Westchester look like paradise. Marcus had worn a suit that fit him perfectly, tailored by an old friend from Brooklyn who had insisted on doing it as a wedding gift. Victoria had worn her grandmother's dress, altered to fit but maintaining its vintage elegance, a connection to family history that transcended the complications of her relationship with her parents. Maya had walked down the aisle with solemn concentration, distributing petals in an even pattern that would have made a mathematician proud. When she reached the front, she had taken her place between Marcus and where Victoria would stand, a physical representation of her central place in their union. Victoria had walked down the aisle alone, having chosen to give herself away rather than navigate the complicated politics of choosing between parents. The guests had risen, a mixture of faces that told the story of their journey. Dorothy Walker beaming with pride, Diana Martinez, who had become a friend after her crucial intervention. The families who had been forced out by Sterling, invited back to reclaim space in the neighborhood. Eleanor, tears streaming down her usually composed face. Marcus's employees and their families. Victoria's college friends, seeing her truly happy for the first time. When Victoria had reached Marcus, he had taken her hands, and for a moment, it had been just the two of them, everything else fading away. Then Maya had tugged on Victoria's dress, and they had both looked down at her, laughing, including her in their moment as she always would be included in their life. Dorothy's ceremony had been perfect, weaving together traditions from different cultures and histories, acknowledging the struggles that had brought them to this moment, while celebrating the love that had overcome those struggles. When she had pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer from the assembled guests had probably been heard 3 blocks away. The reception had been held in the workshop, transformed for the occasion with lights and flowers, but maintaining its essential character. People had danced between the workbenches where Marcus created his art, the smell of wood and varnish mixing with perfume and cologne. Maya had performed a dance she had choreographed herself, telling the story of their family through movement, reducing most of the adults to tears. Eleanor had given a toast that surprised everyone, including Victoria. "I built an empire," she had said, "but my daughter built something more valuable. She built a bridge between worlds that rarely meet, made of love and truth and courage. Marcus, you and Maya have given her something I never could, authenticity. And Victoria, you've given Marcus and Maya something equally valuable, the knowledge that love doesn't recognize the boundaries we create." As the evening had wound down, Marcus and Victoria had stolen a moment alone, standing in the doorway of the workshop looking out at their guests, their black and white and brown faces, their varied ages and backgrounds, their different economic circumstances united in celebration. It was the America that could be, should be, might be, if enough people chose love over fear. "No regrets?" Marcus had asked. "Only that it took so long to find you," Victoria had replied. "We found each other exactly when we were supposed to," Marcus had said, wise as always. They had honeymoon in Italy, Marcus's first time leaving the country, experiencing art and architecture that had only existed in books for him before. But they had both agreed the best part was the small furniture workshop they had discovered in a Tuscan village, where an old craftsman had spent a day teaching Marcus techniques passed down through 10 generations, translating through gesture and demonstration when words failed. Upon returning, they had settled into a rhythm that balanced their different worlds. Victoria had published her novel, not the one she had originally planned, but one that told a fictionalized version of their story, exploring the intersection of race and class and love in modern America. It had become a bestseller, sparking book club discussions and classroom debates about prejudice and privilege. Marcus had continued his furniture business, but also started a training program for young people from underprivileged backgrounds, teaching not just woodworking but life skills, dignity, and the value of creating something lasting with your own hands. Eleanor had funded the program, but Marcus had run it, ensuring it remained grounded in practical skill rather than abstract charity. Maya had thrived with Victoria as her stepmother, then legally adopted mother. The nightmares had faded completely, replaced by dreams of becoming a lawyer like James Williams, or a writer like Victoria, or a craftsman like Marcus. She had options, possibilities, a future unlimited by the prejudices that had tried to constrain her. 2 years into the marriage, Thomas had been born, a perfect blend of his parents' features that made strangers do double takes trying to categorize him. He had Marcus's strong hands and Victoria's bright eyes, a child who would grow up in a world where his mixed heritage was increasingly common, even if not yet fully accepted. The neighborhood had continued to evolve. Some of the families who had supported Sterling had moved away, unable to adjust to the new reality. But new families had moved in, drawn by the story of a community that had confronted its prejudices and chosen to change. The elementary school had become a model for diversity education, with Maya often speaking to classes about her experience, teaching children that difference was to be celebrated, not feared. Dorothy Walker had passed away 3 years after the wedding, peacefully in her sleep at 94. Her funeral had filled the church, a testament to the lives she had touched through decades of quiet resistance and loud love. She had left her house to a trust that Marcus and Victoria administered, turning it into a community center focused on civil rights education and cross-cultural understanding. Sterling had been released after serving 12 years, his sentence reduced for good behavior and cooperation with federal investigations into housing discrimination. He had written to Marcus again, asking if they could meet. Marcus had agreed, bringing Victoria with him to the federal halfway house where Sterling was finishing his sentence. The man they had met was diminished, aged beyond his years, but also somehow clearer, as if prison had burned away pretense and left only truth. He had apologized again, more specifically this time, acknowledging each harm he had caused. He had asked what he could do to make amends. "Live differently," Marcus had said. "When you get out, choose to be better. That's all any of us can do." Sterling had nodded, tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry about Maya. A child should never have suffered for my prejudice. She's stronger because of it," Victoria had said. "Not that that excuses what you did, but she's become an advocate for other children facing discrimination. Your hatred created a warrior for love." As they had left, Sterling had called out, "Thank you for seeing me as human even when I didn't see you that way." Marcus had turned back. "Everyone deserves a chance at redemption. Don't waste yours." 5 years after that confrontational HOA meeting, the Thompson-Pemberton family gathered for Thanksgiving. The table stretched across the dining room and into the living room, accommodating the crowd that had become their chosen family. Marcus carved the turkey while Victoria managed the logistics of feeding 25 people. Maya, now 13 and poised beyond her years, helped Thomas, 5 and energetic, with his table-setting duties. Baby Eleanor, named for her grandmother who had become an integral part of their lives, gurgled from her high chair. The assembled guests represented every thread of their woven life. James Williams and his new wife, Diana Martinez and her family, Mrs. Rodriguez and her children. The 3 families Sterling had forced out, who had returned to the neighborhood and become close friends. Marcus's employees and their families, Victoria's friend from Yale with her husband and twins. Eleanor, who had retired early to spend more time with her grandchildren, helping Thomas build something with blocks Marcus had made. As they sat for dinner, Marcus stood to give his annual toast. The tradition had started at their first Thanksgiving as a married couple and had continued, evolving each year but maintaining its core message. "We gather at this table," he began, "built by my hands from wood that grew for decades before we met, in a house that has seen joy and sorrow, prejudice and acceptance, hatred and love. We gather as family, not all born, but all chosen, connected not by blood alone, but by the decision to see each other as fully human." He looked at Victoria, who was holding baby Eleanor while trying to keep Thomas from eating cranberry sauce with his fingers. 5 years ago, this community tried to tear us apart because they couldn't imagine love between people who looked different. Today, our children grow up in a world where their existence is proof that love transcends the boundaries we create. He raised his glass, filled with cider Maya had helped make from apples from their own trees. To those who stood with us when standing was dangerous. To those who changed when change was hard. To the children who will inherit a better world because we refused to accept the world as it was. To love that conquers fear. To truth that defeats lies. To dignity that outlasts discrimination. To family, everyone chorused, glasses clinking, children laughing, love filling every corner of the house that had been a battlefield and was now a fortress of acceptance. After dinner, as the adults cleaned and children played, Victoria found herself standing in the doorway of Marcus's workshop. He joined her, slipping his arm around her waist, both of them looking at the space where their life together had really begun. "I never thanked you," Victoria said suddenly. "For what?" Marcus asked. "For seeing through Sarah Mitchell to find Victoria. For giving me a chance to become who I really am instead of who I was pretending to be." "You did the same for me," Marcus replied. "You saw through the careful control I maintained, the walls I'd built after Lisa died. You helped me believe I could love again, trust again, fight for something beyond just survival." They stood there as the sun set, painting the workshop golden, listening to the sounds of their family in the house behind them. Maya was teaching Thomas a card game while Eleanor dozed in her grandmother's arms. Laughter drifted from the kitchen where friends washed dishes and told stories. "We did it," Victoria said softly. "We actually did it." "We did," Marcus agreed. "We took their hatred and transformed it into love. We took their fear and transformed it into family. We took their discrimination and transformed it into diversity." A knock at the workshop door interrupted them. Maya stood there, her face serious. "Mom, Dad, there's something on the news you should see." They followed her into the living room where the television showed a breaking news report. Another case of housing discrimination, this time in a suburb of Chicago. Another black family being harassed by their HOA. Another modern lynching dressed in bureaucracy and bias. "We should help them," Maya said firmly. "Like Mrs. Walker helped us." Marcus and Victoria exchanged glances, a conversation without words. They had built their happiness, their family, their life. They could rest in it, protect it, preserve it. Or they could extend it, share it, use their story to help others facing the same battles. "We'll call James tomorrow," Marcus said. "See what legal support they need." "I'll reach out to my publisher," Victoria added. "Maybe an op-ed about our experience would help." "And I'll start a social media campaign at school," Maya said, already planning. "My generation needs to know this is still happening." Eleanor looked up from baby Eleanor. "I'll call my contacts in Chicago. Pemberton Pharmaceuticals has offices there. We can apply economic pressure." And so it continued, the ripples of their story spreading outward, touching lives they would never know. The workshop where Marcus shaped wood became a metaphor for how they shaped society. One careful cut at a time, one patient sand at a time, one precise joint at a time, building something beautiful and lasting from raw materials that others might have discarded. Late that night, After everyone had gone home and the children were asleep, Marcus and Victoria lay in bed, exhausted but content. The house was quiet except for the settling of old wood and the whisper of wind through the oak trees outside. "Do you think it will ever really change?" Victoria asked. "The prejudice, the hatred, the fear of difference?" Marcus considered the question, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "My grandmother used to say that change was like carpentry. You can't rush it. You have to work with the grain, not against it. You have to be patient with the imperfections while you work to smooth them out. And you have to believe that what you're building is worth the effort, even when you can't see the final product." "So we keep building?" Victoria asked. "We keep building," Marcus confirmed. "One piece at a time, one family at a time, one heart at a time." They fell asleep holding hands, their different-colored skin no longer a source of conflict but a symbol of possibility. In the morning, they would wake to children's laughter and the challenges of a new day. They would face whatever came with the dignity and love that had carried them this far. They would continue to prove that love was stronger than hate, that courage could defeat cowardice, that the future they were building for their children was worth every battle they had fought. The house stood solid around them, the workshop waited for tomorrow's creations, and the family they had built from struggle and joy slept peacefully under one roof. The transformation was complete, but the work continued, would always continue. As long as there were people brave enough to love across the lines that others drew, strong enough to stand against injustice, and wise enough to know that every small victory contributed to the larger triumph of human dignity over human prejudice. In the end, Marcus Thompson and Victoria Pemberton Thompson had not set out to change the world. They had simply wanted to love each other and raise their children in peace. But sometimes, the most revolutionary act was simply refusing to accept the limitations others tried to impose, insisting on love when others demanded hate, choosing unity when others required division. Their story, begun in deception and conflict, had become a testament to the transformative power of truth and love, rippling outward in waves that would continue long after they were gone, inspiring others to build their own bridges across the chasms that divided humanity. The morning would come, as mornings always did, with new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight, in this house that had been a battlefield and was now a sanctuary, in this bed that held a love that had conquered prejudice, in this moment of perfect peace, they were simply Marcus and Victoria, husband and wife, father and mother, two people who had found each other against all odds and chosen to build a life together that proved love was always stronger than hate, always more powerful than fear, always more lasting than the temporary victories of small minds and smaller hearts. Their love story had become legend in Westchester and beyond, told in book clubs and classrooms, in churches and community centers, wherever people gathered to discuss how to bridge the divisions that seemed to define modern America. But for them, it was simply their life, lived one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time, building a future where their children could be fully themselves without apology or explanation, where love was just love, where families were just families, where the color of skin mattered less than the content of character.